We're live. Hello, everyone.
Live. Do you remember that thing in Big Brother where it's like, you're now live on Channel 4, please do not swear? That's the opposite of what we want here. That's the opposite. Friends, you will notice that we have the lovely Nathen with us. Before we jump in to hearing what he's going to talk about, shall I do the thing?
Do the thing.
Let's do the thing. Let's disclaim, shall we? Hello, friends. Welcome. It's Wednesday. It's just gone 8:15. That means it's time for History After Dark. You know why we did this. This was a place where we could come away from our other social medias where we are literally the paragons of grace and decorum and good taste. And this is a space where we can let our freak flags fly. We can do some four-letter expletives, some filth, some smart, some innuendo, in your endo. So if you are in an open plan office with a judgmental boss, put a headphone in. If you are in a office, a car, a basement, that's for later, with a small child, in our head this child is called Timmy. Have you got the mug? Get your mugs out, babe. Timmy is a problem, as you can see from our merch. Timmy's a sort of oh hello, he's kicking off. Timmy's a sort of child that hears one depraved thing one time and he will take him to school with him and he will repeat it in front of his teacher. In my head, this teacher is like Miss Honey from Matilda. She does not watch History After Dark, and so therefore she does not know the first cardinal rule of History After Dark, which is, if you don't know what it is, don't Google it. It's not for you. So she Googles it. Now you've been called up at school. Why is Miss Honey in the fetal position in the corner, non-verbal, rocking back and forth? You're now on the hook for 12 weeks of therapy. And also you've got social services on the phone because they want to know why Timmy knows this thing. It's awkward for everybody. Put a headphone in. Alternatively, you can watch it on the playback here on the YouTubes. It is, though, always worth watching us live. On one occasion, we did say something that was so unspeakably depraved, so borderline illegal, we had to yeet that footage directly into the sun because we're all too pretty for prison. It's not happened for a while, which means one of three things. We've improved, highly unlikely. Secondly, we're due another one, very possible. Or third, and I think this is probably what's going on, we've now spent so much time with each other that we have lowered the bar so significantly that it is, in fact, in hell. You know what you're getting into. If at any point I see anyone in the comments of these videos or on our other social medias saying something along the lines of, I like the history of History After Dark, but do you have to swear so much? It's not very ladylike. I know what you want. You want me to pin that comment so that other people will come and humiliate you. Look, I'm not going to get on you about your kinks. They might. I'm not going to kink shame. But here's the dealio. Kink without consent is not okay. If you want to have a car battery pinned up to your bollocks while some woman named Jessica kicks you repeatedly in the nipples while calling you smegma on the tip of her nose, that's up to you. But you pay for the privilege and she is a volunteer. All right? A paid volunteer, I should add. I'm sure I can find you a number. This, friends, is History After Dark. We've got our lovely guest, Nathen, who's been here before, so he's not too surprised by the filth that's just come out of my mouth. Let's talk about this Beaufort bloke. What's happening?
Well, first and foremost, how do you remember that every time?
I've got a deviant twisted mind. It's in there.
Shakespeare moment, you know, your great rant, your soliloquy.
Yeah, I mean, it could be to be or not to be, but it does involve much more references to bollocks. Everyone has their talents.
I thought Jessica was a rather tame name for tonight. But
yeah,
I know two people called Jessica.
And
one was a fucking bitch.
Oh.
So
there we go. Perfect for the job. That's a requirement.
I remember in school, right, when I was about 14 years old, we were allowed to go on the bus to the big city, Swansea, shit ton. But you know, when we were 14, coming from the valleys, go to the big city, and we saw this woman on the bus. She must 20 odd. And she was gorgeous, and we all were like, couldn't believe how beautiful she was. You know, we're little 14-year-old boys from the valleys. And I remember one of them trying to come up with a name for her. What do you think her name is? And we all said Jessica, we just assumed that Jessica was a hot girl's name.
And to this day,
Rabbit,
that's what that is.
Yeah. So when you said Jessica, I
took you right back there. Yeah. I triggered in you a childhood early sexual enlightenment. I mean, we could talk about this in therapy later.
No, you're okay. Right. History.
Yes.
Right,
history.
Okay. With the filth left in.
Questions about why that girl Jessica I know isn't very nice. Please feel free to message me, and I will answer extremely honestly because I hate her and she deserves it.
Fabulous. Fabulous.
Yeah, I can tell you where you can find her on social media and everything.
Maybe that's for later.
I
Back to
don't know
therapy,
much about Thomas Beaufort, so you
as
can
we're here. Yeah,
lay it
Yeah,
all bare.
yeah.
Now, where's he
Right.
even fit in? Who is he?
Okay, so Thomas Beaufort. Why is Thomas Beaufort, I guess, my history hero? This is where we're going. To put it succinctly, which is not really my strength at all, and this is not going to be succinct whatsoever. This is going to be an hour-long mental unleashing of things that have been deep in my mind for a long time. Thomas Beaufort is a Beaufort. He is perhaps best known as being one of the children of John of Gaunt and his mistress, Catherine Swynford. John of Gaunt is a great history hero to many people. Not quite, he doesn't quite rank as high in the list of fictional historical heroes like a Richard III, oddly, or, Anne Boleyn, etc. But John of Gaunt, I think a lot of people know who he is. A lot of people love the story of John of Gaunt and Catherine Swynford, essentially a Plantagenet prince who scandalously married his mistress, a mistress with whom he had 4 illegitimate children. And these were the Beaufort family. John of Gaunt and Catherine Swynford have 4 children. They named them John, Henry, Joan, and Thomas. And in case I said Joan there, it's because I once gave a talk where I kept on talking about Joan Beaufort, and a woman told me that with my Welsh accent, Joan sounds like John, and she was getting very confused. So now it's given me a bit of trauma. Whenever I say Joan, I kind of do this big
English.
Trump-esque Joan. But they were the Beauforts. This was an illegitimate family who were later legitimized. And this is quite an interesting story in itself. John of Gaunt has this mistress. He has children with her. But late in life, when he loses, his first 2 wives, who he married for political purposes, he decides to take another wife. And most people assume he's going to marry a great heiress, a foreign princess perhaps. But he marries Catherine Swynford. In late in life, he marries her. And I would assume this is because this is one of the rare instances we have in the medieval period of a love match, a true love match, not an arranged marriage that becomes a love-in. John of Gaunt has married this mother of his illegitimate children because he loves her and he wants to end his life with her. But this did cause a scandal in England and abroad because people couldn't understand why John of Gaunt was marrying a woman who had no money to bring to the marriage. That's what the chroniclers were writing about. The French were scandalized because she was of humble birth. But the marriage, which takes place in 1396 in Lincoln, it allows John of Gaunt to begin the process of legitimizing his bastard offspring. And to do this, you have to appeal to Pope and Parliament, because there's 2 laws of the day. There's the ecclesiastical law and there's the civil law. So John of Gaunt, powerful prince, he sends a messenger off to Rome, and the Pope is happy to grant this. He grants the rights of legitimacy upon these children as if they were born in lawful matrimony. Then the King of England, Richard II, he's got a lot of problems going on at this point in time, and he wants to keep his Uncle John on his good side. So Richard II also passes a parliamentary act that allows the Beauforts to be legitimized. So suddenly, aged about 19 years old, Thomas Beaufort's gone from being just a bastard child of a duke, the youngest child as well, to being a legitimate grandson of Edward III. And this transforms his status, because going forward now, Thomas Beaufort can start to be given opportunities that he would not have been allowed as a bastard child. But he's still the youngest son of this family. So his eldest brother, John Beaufort, becomes an earl, the Earl of Somerset, because now he's allowed to become an earl. He's legitimized. His brother, Henry Beaufort, enters the church and quickly becomes Bishop of Lincoln and then Bishop of Winchester. Bishop of Winchester was richer than any other churchman during the medieval period. Thomas's sister Joan, she is now able to marry an earl, the Earl of Westmoreland. But Thomas, he can't become the statesman of a family. That's John. He can't become the churchman. That's his brother. I mean, he might have been able to become a countess. I'm not really sure what the deal with trans rights, etc. back then, but he didn't go down that route. His only option allowed for him was to become a soldier. He had to go to war to make his fortune. Now, at the start of the 15th century, there's a lot going on. His half-brother, Henry IV, has just usurped the throne. He's taken down Richard II. So Thomas Beaufort has gone from being an illegitimate son of a duke to being the legitimate son of a duke to being the half-brother of the king. So very quickly, a lot is happening for this young man. But also, the Welsh are causing trouble at this period. Owain Glyndwr, great hero in his own regard. He raises the banner of revolution and he wants to go batter some Englishmen, which is, always fun to do on the rugby field in a fair and polite manner. But it does mean that opportunity is there for Thomas Beaufort to make a name for himself. And Thomas goes into Wales to fight and defend the Lancastrian crown that is now his family's crown. And he serves an apprenticeship in Wales. He becomes captain of Ludlow Castle. He enters Carmarthen Castle. And all of the time he's in Wales, learning his trade as a soldier, he's fighting alongside his young nephew, the future Henry V. And this is the start of a very important relationship between these two men. Because even though they're uncle and nephew, Prince Henry is only 8 years younger than Thomas. So they very quickly team up. They become really well known, a brotherhood of sorts. Now, furthermore, moving forward, what happens with Thomas is that he starts to prove himself in this martial arena. And so he starts to get given more responsibility. And one of them is he gets appointed an admiral of the fleet. So he moves from fighting the Welsh on sea to defending England at sea, from land to sea. And he proves himself again very competent. And this is essentially the origins of Thomas Beaufort. He is this young man making his way in the world and proving himself quite competent. Shall I carry on? Is there any questions?
Can I jump in with a question? This is actually about, this is going back to the legitimization. That's a really hard word to say. It feels to me that it's a real belt and braces approach. Like, he marries the mum, the Pope says okay, all of the documents are written, and then the king of the day is like, these kids are all legitimate, have some titles, have a bishop's palace, delicious. Why is it that one of the things that gets hollered against Henry VII is that he comes from a bastard line, therefore he has no claim to the throne? Where is that coming from?
Modern day Ricardian attempts to denigrate and diminish the Tudors. There's always been, in recent decades, an attempt to try and bring down every single part of the Tudor legend, the Tudor myth, that they possibly can. And they try and throw so much at the wall in the hope that something stick. And this is one of them. The Beauforts were barred from the throne, therefore Henry Tudor should never have been able to claim the crown. Well, first and foremost, Henry Tudor claimed the crown by conquest, so it's irrelevant anyway.
Might over right, yeah.
Yeah, the legitimization is interesting because I seem to be the only historian who's actually gone to the original source and checked it out, okay? Now, what's happened is, in 1397, Parliament have passed an act that says the Beauforts can inherit or attain everything. Principalities, duchies, offices, etc., which was the case. 10 years later, John Beaufort, the eldest of the Beaufort family, asks for an exemplification of this charter. And basically that means he wants a copy. We don't know why he wants this copy. He could have lost the original letter. It could be something as simple as that. It could be there's a new king on the throne and he just wants to make sure everything is okay because he's now got 4 children of his own to look after. And the theory goes that it was during this period that Henry IV granted his Beaufort brothers another copy of this legitimization, but he added 3 words: acceptat dignitat regale, which means accept to the royal dignity. And it means the Beauforts can inherit everything except the crown. Now, there's few problems with this. First and foremost, why would Henry IV do that? He has 4 sons, and the understanding is those sons are going to have sons. The idea that anyone was suspecting the Beauforts of having designs on the crown in 1407, when there were so many people potentially ahead of them, doesn't make sense. Secondly, Henry IV doesn't really seem to have had any negative issues with his Beaufort brothers to put this in. But what's happened is later on down the centuries, somebody has unfurled the original parliamentary roll. And these words are written on the 1397 Act of Parliament, except to the royal dignity. So when historians have just casually written about this in books, when they've written it, it looks quite serious. You know, you can inherit all offices except the royal dignity. But no one's gone back to look at the actual document, which I did for my Beaufort book. And these words are scribbled in between the lines. Okay, so they're scribbled in. Now, this original Act of Parliament in 1397, if you want to change that and you want to update it to add these 3 words, what you need to do is you need to have Parliament called. Parliament needs to say this act no longer stands. We're going to create a new act which supersedes it, or you can make the changes and we agree to those changes. That never happened. We have the 1407 Parliament rules, and nobody's ever mentioned anything about this change. Going forward to 1450 is the first time we hear about the Beaufort claim to the throne, because William de la Pole, the Earl of Suffolk, the Duke of Suffolk, is executed. He's, they claim he's a traitor, etc. And one of the crimes Parliament levy against him is that he married his 7-year-old son, John de la Pole, to a certain child named Margaret Beaufort. And the plan was for him to use that lineage to claim the throne. Nobody in 1450 went, well, obviously he can do that because they were barred. So that's the first thing. The second thing, 1485 rolls around. Richard III goes nuts, trying to do everything he can to diminish Henry Tudor's claim to the throne. He says that Henry Tudor is born from an illegitimate line, which on one hand is true. The Beauforts were originally illegitimate. He mentions on his father's side, the Welsh Tudor side, Henry Tudor is born from illegitimate origins. The one thing Richard III never says is Henry Tudor was barred from the throne. Because if Henry Tudor was barred from the throne, then Richard III, all he had to do was say that, and it would significantly hamper Henry Tudor's facts. So I question, were they barred? Where's this evidence they were barred? Parliament never said they were barred. Now, I do have one quick theory on when these 3 words were written in. Now, I'm sure some sort of testing can find out when they were written, but in 1407, there is a factional war going on at the court of England, at the English court. On one side is Archbishop Arundel, who is the Chancellor. On the other side are the 3 Beaufort brothers and their nephew, Prince Henry. And they hate each other. They're all fighting for control of the government, and the government goes back and forth between them both. Anyone who's reading Helen Caster's fantastic new book at the moment will be able to read all of this in huge detail. Because Henry IV, the king, is sick. I would speculate Archbishop Arundel hates the Beauforts. And as Chancellor, he is in charge of all of the parliamentary rules. He's in charge of all of the documents. Has he had somebody write this in to the document to in future use against the Beauforts if needed. But the bottom line is, Parliament never ruled on this. So even the idea that the Beauforts were barred from the throne makes sense if you read it in a book written out. If you study the actual history, look at the original sources, it's nonsense. But it is something Ricardians bring up on a day-to-day basis, completely overlooking the fact that Henry Tudor went, well, I'm king, so I'm king anyway, which makes it all... I mean, I've just wasted 15 minutes ranting about it. And then I'm going to say, it doesn't matter.
No one's ever mentioned that before, so that's amazing. Oh, we've lost Kat. We've lost your sound.
So there you go. Is that better?
Yeah.
Also, it's absolutely not a waste because for many reasons. First of all, you laid it out incredibly clearly, and on top of that, it shows the value. First of all, of going to the original source material, or if you can't do that, the value of facsimile copy. That it's not simply enough to have transcription. That these and as people ask questions about whether or not physical copies of, for example, wills should be destroyed, the answer is no, because the original, how it's laid out, what's written on it matters, and particularly if people are not adverse to adding in wordings in physical vellum manuscripts. What do we think people are prepared to do to digitized facsimile, or not even digitized copies of things that aren't even in facsimile? So yeah, the keeping of the original documents and the ability to access them, you just pointed out just how vital that is for understanding the truth of the history. So thank you so much for doing that.
I would have loved to have put that picture in my book, but unfortunately the charges for that picture from the National Archives, it's just too expensive for me to have done it. But I do show it during my talk when I used to give in-person talks in the Beauforts, and you get that moment. Every talk I do, I try and get a moment where the audience are thinking, and it's that eureka moment, I guess. And that always comes up when I do the Beaufort talk. You can see people looking at the picture and understanding how these three words have been scribbled. It's called an interlineation, just scribbled in between the lines. But unless Parliament ruled on that, it's nothing more than graffiti, essentially.
Yeah. It's defacing the manuscript.
Yeah.
Because also I think it's impossible. I don't know if to use that word necessarily, but I would say it's borderline impossible that is a correction made at the time. Vellum is expensive. The copyist hand in those are perfect. There's not a smudge. There's like these are, any defacement to the vellum is because of maybe a mite has got into it later. They pick the finest skin for this. There's not even a mosquito bite hole in it. The notion that somebody's just been like, oh, I missed out a few words, boom, boom, let's put those
not
in.
Just any
not
few
likely.
Words. Not just any few words. A
Very important couple of words.
3 words.
Not likely that would have been done at the time.
Yeah.
Just saying.
Like I said, whenever it was added, once it's been rolled up and chucked back onto the shelves, that's not been seen. Probably, I haven't even found out when this first came to light.
Do you know who first said that?
Historical writing as we really understand it, we're talking like the 1700s antiquarians are really starting to transcribe all these documents, and thank God they did, because people like me can write books, willy-nilly these days because of their work, even though you should always try and get to the sources if possible. And I just imagine someone's, again, once it's written down in modern typesetting, you can't put those words in between lines. No. They just included it in brackets. And Ricardians, they love this. And even recently, quite a well-known Ricardian author has consistently tried to push this line and fight back about how it is, how the Beauforts were barred. And again, 500 years ago, I mean, okay, let's make every monarch since Henry Tudor null and void and start all over again. I mean, I'm not massively sure what the objective is for some people, but
what made you decide to have a look at that document? I know you always try and look at as many as you can, but I presume there's a limit to how much you can do. Was there something about the legitimacy claim that had
Yeah, because I already knew from Facebook and reading other books, this is the thing that people mention when they talk about the Beauforts. So if I'm going to write a book, the first biography of this family, then you need to really be going in for the big things, which is the fun, really, of writing books that aren't necessarily straight up. I mean, obviously they're all great men and they're all noble white medieval men, but you know, they're not the Henry V or the Henry VI or Henry II, Henry VII. You know, like I've written a full biography of him. I'm looking at different angles and trying to pull out what's more interesting. And it does mean that, you know, a very well-known, very famous Henry V biography has just come out, but it's not really within that author's remit to go off down side streets looking to question about the Beaufort legitimacy. So it becomes ingrained because authors, quite frankly, don't have time to go down every side street, every side quest. And this is how myths become facts, because it just keeps on getting regurgitated. And I'm sure I've done that exactly in every one of my books, where I'm just repeating. You know, if you ask me about Anne Boleyn right now, I'll probably give you the standard historiography of her without taking on board all of the new evidence, because I just haven't gone down that route. Which is why I do love about writing myself. Is you're the investigator. You're looking down these streets. You're trying to find out something for the first time. And again, I love this idea of the Beaufort legitimacy problem. Helen Castor, in a new book, she's the greatest historical narrative non-fiction writer of all time for me. I'm very happy to see that she mentions it without going down the what is now the standardized route of saying they were barred from the throne, because guess what, she knows what she's talking about. But there we go.
Amazing. So what's so good about Thomas, though? Why do you like him?
Right. So I mean, I've given you Thomas's early career. Now
how young was he when he started, like,
stabbing people?
Yeah.
Is he about 19? Yeah. So the brief story I've given you, we've gone from 1396 to about 1405, and he's in his early 20s, you know, at this point now, and he's starting to develop this reputation for himself as someone who's actually quite competent. And in 1405, Henry IV, whose reign is full of rebellions, faces a rebellion from an archbishop, the Archbishop of York, Henry Scrope. And this is a problem for Henry IV, and he has Archbishop Scrope arrested. But he's an archbishop. So what the archbishop's attitude is. Henry IV sends his brother, Thomas Beaufort, to York to deal with this. And we get this interesting story in the Chronicles where the Archbishop comes face to face with Thomas Beaufort, and Thomas Beaufort tries to steal his staff away from him. And the Archbishop is indignant, you know, who do you think you are to do this? Only the Pope can do that. And Thomas kind of squares up to him and says, you're a traitor. You don't deserve this staff. And they end up in a bit of a scuffle. Within a couple of days, the Archbishop's trial in York is conducted. Thomas Beaufort sits in judgment. You know, he's not the only one. He's part of a council, but the Archbishop is executed. And I believe this is the only, certainly to that point, this is the only instance an Archbishop was murdered or executed by an English king. Because, of course, Thomas Becket was not officially a sanctioned death. And this is something that would trouble Henry IV to the end of his days. You know, you do not execute archbishop. But Thomas Beaufort was there at the forefront as a young man ready to step up and do this. And it is interesting because then as the reign progresses, Henry IV falls ill and he's removed from the frontline political world. And as I mentioned earlier, this is where the Beauforts start to take control of the kingdom with their nephew, Henry V, the future Henry V. And there's an instance where Thomas Beaufort, this is where I start to really get interested in his story. Up to this point, he's a soldier. You know, he's just a battering ram soldier at sea and on land. But he's appointed Chancellor. And this is very interesting. In 1410, he's appointed a Chancellor as part of this huge it's like the Tories today. There's back and forth chaos at the top of government is going on, and Thomas Beaufort becomes Chancellor, and he's the first non-churchman to hold this role since 1383, and the first person to hold this chancellorship without a title whatsoever since 1372. So that's 38 years. He's the first non-churchman or non-title person to hold it. And this tells me something. To be chancellor, you've got to be essentially the most educated man, or one of the most educated men in the kingdom. You've got to read and write in an age when not everyone was reading and writing. You've got to be able to argue persuasively in the council. You've got to justify royal decisions to Parliament, to the Commons. We see Thomas Beaufort very quickly move from being a soldier to being a statesman, just like that. He must have been a remarkable man to be able to bridge that gap, which most couldn't. You were either one or the other. But I mean, the House of Lancaster always valued education. So I find him quite interesting that he possessed these skills, these extra dimensions to him. Now, importantly, during this year, his elder brother, John Beaufort, dies. So suddenly there's a gap in the family as well. The great head of the family, John Beaufort, Earl of Somerset, has died. Thomas Beaufort's turn is now to step up into the peerage. And this coincides with the death of his brother, his other brother, the half-brother, Henry IV. And who comes to the throne? Henry V. And he's now Henry V is like, I'm going to go beat up some French. I've battered the Welsh. I'm going to go beat up some Frenchman. He's like a medieval, I don't know, Will Carlin, if you know your 90s England rugby references. And he's decided he's already taken on the Scots. So there we go. He's happy to go and take everybody on. And he calls Thomas Beaufort to his side. Thomas Beaufort has created the Earl of Dorset. And he goes, you're coming with me. We're going to invade France. And this is where Thomas Beaufort becomes remarkable. We all know Henry V's French wars. We all know the greatness, immortality that he accomplished. But when they crossed the Channel for the first time in 1415, the first thing they've got to do is establish a gateway in Normandy. They already have Calais up on the North French coast. They need another gateway where they can then start to invade and conquer France, which is the intention. And they besiege Harfleur, and they do conquer it quite quickly. Now, Henry V wants to go home. He's done what he's come to set out to do. He's now going to march his army home to Calais. He needs someone to stay in charge in Harfleur for the entire winter, to look after it, to rebuild the town, and to evict all the French people in that town and replace them with English people. And he asks Thomas Beaufort to do this. He makes him the governor of Harfleur. Now, Henry and his army leave Thomas behind. Thomas is left with only 300 men, and he's given this task. Henry's route home would obviously be quite difficult. He ends up fighting Agincourt to try and get his way home, and he wins immortality, and so do his soldiers. Not poor Thomas Beaufort. He's stuck back in Harfleur, holding this town, which is surrounded by French, trying to get at him. Now, 7 months he spends at Harfleur, and it's difficult. They've got no money. They've got no food. Times are tough. And if Thomas Beaufort gives in at this moment, then Henry V would not be able to come back to France to accomplish what he did. He needs this gateway. And there is an interesting episode that occurs in March 1416 when Thomas Beaufort has had enough. London are not giving him the money he needs. I mean, we still hear that today if you live in the provinces. London are not giving him the money he needs, and his men have got no food. So he opens the gates to Harfleur and he starts to march in enemy territory on the lookout for food. Now, he marches about 20 miles when suddenly he's faced with the French army. And the French army are trying to attack and kill these 300 Englishmen. And a herald comes to Thomas Beaufort, or so alleged, believed by a later account, comes to Thomas Beaufort and asks him, give up now. You are surrounded, Englishmen. Your men are going to die. We do not want to shed any more Christian blood. And Thomas Beaufort, I'm a Welshman, okay, but I get quite goosebumps to this. Thomas Beaufort turns to him and goes, "Tell your master Englishmen will never surrender." And it's a great line, you know. It's forget all that Shakespeare, we precious few, band of brothers nonsense by Henry V. This is Thomas Beaufort standing up, facing down the might of France, just him and a couple of hundred people, a real band of brothers, and saying, "No, Frenchman." But of course, he can't defeat that army. So what he does is during nightfall, him and his men move back. And they march through a forest till they reach the French coast. And then they march 20 miles along the beach to try and get back to Harfleur. Now, anyone who's walked on a beach in flip-flops can find it quite difficult. Try and do that as a moving armed force. You know, that must have been some slog going along the beach. And they actually make it back to Harfleur, but just as they're about to get in the gateway, a second French army attacks them. And many of the Englishmen are killed just as they can see the town in front of them. Thomas Beaufort manages to fight off the French coming for him, and a few of them do make it back into the town safely. They only stop to strip the dead of their armor, which apparently is what you do in medieval times. Now, this was fascinating because it was a very risky maneuver that could have cost him his life, but he needed food. Desperate times call for desperate measures. But back in England, this was portrayed as a great victory. They said Thomas Beaufort alone killed 2,000 Frenchmen, and he was a war hero. And for this, he was actually made Duke of Exeter. And you know what we call this, don't we? This news back in England. This is fake news, medieval style. You know, 2,000 men, like some sort of bloody medieval Terminator. The truth is, it was a horrific time for him. You know, the sheer struggles and tough, you know, talk about tough times he had to put up with. And he made it, and he was rewarded by becoming the Duke of Exeter. But crucially, he kept that town throughout this winter with no supplies and little food. And that means the following summer, when Henry V turns up with his nice little crown on his head, Henry V is able to invade and over the next couple of years conquer Normandy and with it beyond France. And none of that happens without Thomas Beaufort.
I had no idea he was so significant in the Henry. I mean, clearly Henry V can't do everything he did on his own, but
yeah,
it's,
you know, even then when we push forward to 2 years, I mean, Rouen is the second greatest French city. It's the capital of Normandy. And 3 years into this invasion of France, Henry V wants not Rouen. He needs it. He needs to capture this town to open up the road to Paris. And the English army, with Thomas Beaufort there, begin to set siege. Now, Henry, again, this is the importance of Thomas Beaufort to all of this. Henry sends Thomas Beaufort to the gates of Rouen with a message: surrender now or I'll kill you all. That's the message of Henry V to the town of Rouen. And they go, we're not coming out. Look at our city. We're fine. They don't know this English king. This English king is merciless. He surrounds Rouen on all sides, and he starves them for 6 months. At one point, the people of Rouen, they decide to expel all of their women and children because they feel the English will take mercy on them. They can't afford to feed them anymore. The people in the city are living on the flesh of mice, rats, and cats. So they get rid of the women and children. You can't defend the city. Disappear, and the English will save you. The women and children, and this is not a French source. This is an English soldier source, John Page, who was there at this moment. The French women and children come up to the English army and they ask for mercy. Henry V sends an order down the ranks, leave them there to die. And they are left in this no man's land, starving to death, screaming their heads off, whilst their men are watching from the town gates, having sent them I mean, they would have died anyway, I guess, but still watching them out there in the no man's land between the town and the army. And, Thomas Beaufort obviously can't do anything about this, even if he wanted to do anything about this. That's the orders. And surprisingly, after 6 months, Rouen finally surrenders. Now, the man the keys were given to go into the town was Thomas Beaufort. He's the first man in at the head of the army, and the scene that he's met with is just death. Death everywhere. The few people who've survived are but skin and bones. But his job is to go up to the top of the castle and put up the flag of St. George. Now, once again, of all the men Henry V has with him, he chooses Thomas to be his governor of Rouen. Again, he's given this very delicate task to hold on to this town whilst Henry pushes on to Paris. Now, I'm not going to go into the whole full story of how Henry V gets Paris, and because we could be here all night, really, by Dan Jones's new book. But when Paris falls to the English, and with it the French king, Thomas Beaufort is given a third task. He is now appointed governor of Paris, and he's given control of the aged French king, Charles VI. These are all such deep indications of his competency, of how important he was to Henry personally, politically, militarily. He really was this vital cog in this machine. The one person who Henry really seems to come to depend on and trust. He must have been some soldier, but also not just a soldier, calm, collected, disciplined, able to hold and marshal and, I don't know, do I can't say that word, whatever. You know what I'm saying? Yeah, there we go. It's a remarkable story, this story up to this point, when you consider he started off in Wales as a teenager with Henry V, then Prince Henry, and this is where they've come together. This is brotherhood. This is this band of brothers that Shakespeare rattles on about.
Well, they're fairly close in age, then, aren't they? I think.
Yeah, they're 8 years apart. Yeah.
Yeah. So they probably do feel more like brothers. You're knocked off your sound again.
He's like the cool older brother, then, basically.
Yeah, I imagine so.
I think what's interesting is that, because there are kings who have brothers who serve at their side, who then become a focus of concern or jealousy or accusations of treason. It's very telling that Henry is going, you are going to essentially be my deputy in every single setting. I trust you to be militarily skillful, diplomatic, potentially as brutal as I would be, but I do not fear that you have your eyes on the crown, despite the fact that clearly you have all of the skill set that I have, much of the same breeding, but there's not one part of me that thinks I cannot trust you implicitly to be loyal to me. And I find that really interesting.
I think this is also again, I'm not really an historian. I don't like him, of Henry V, but this is very much an indication of how strong a leader Henry V was, because obviously the big skill set that he had was keeping everybody on his side. Now, he himself had 3 younger full brothers, of course, the Duke of Bedford, the Duke of Gloucester, and the Duke of Lancaster. We know that as a prince, he didn't get on with his second brother, Thomas of Lancaster, who was very much their father's favourite. Humphrey of Gloucester, the younger brother, he's not really on the scene too much at this point, but I mean, he grew up to be a bit of a bulb. I'm sure Henry V knew that. Duke of Bedford was a great lieutenant for Henry V. So, maybe he does see something in Thomas Beaufort, who's older than his younger brothers. So, there's no real worry that Thomas Beaufort is going to somehow try and usurp the throne, because clearly it's Henry V, then it's Henry V's 3 younger brothers, full brothers. They're all going to have multitude of children. It should be expected in the end, between 4 brothers, they have 1 son, the future Henry VI. So, there's not even this worry of being usurped. This is all about the House of Lancaster. And the one thing about the Beauforts and the Lancastrians, they are so tight-knit. And this goes on to the reign of Henry VI, and he's one of the major causes of the Wars of the Roses. How the later Beauforts are so close to the Lancastrian dynasty, but at no point whatsoever are they usurping the Lancastrians' rights. They are all in. It's a tight-knit family network fostered by John of Gaunt for the greatness of this one family. Look at the House of York. They really didn't have that going for them. You know, talk about a group of brothers who were determined to undo themselves at every step. But yeah, certainly up to this point, we reached the peak of Thomas Beaufort's career. Ultimately, is 1420. Henry V marries Catherine of Valois in Troyes Cathedral. She's the daughter of the French king. The deal is struck, with Thomas Beaufort being one of the signatories. The deal is struck that Henry V is going to inherit the crown of France, and he's going to build a dual monarchy, England and France. And at his side for this wedding is Thomas Beaufort. Obviously, there are all of the nobility. I don't want to try and ham up Thomas Beaufort too much, but he certainly is, again, step by step. And this is what he's given blood, sweat, and tears throughout this campaign. He's lost a couple of nephews. You know, the younger Beauforts struggle in France. You know, there is death around the family. But come 1420, it's good. They've won. Henry V is going to go on to reign forever as a glorious king of France and England. Or is he?
Well, of course, he does the very selfish thing of shitting himself to death. So there is that.
And to bring it back to my boy Tommy B, when Henry V is dying in Paris in 1422, guess we call suicide for the.
Oh my God, poor sod.
Yeah. I mean, definitely poor sod. You know, this isn't.
I've seen it all. Not right.
The bloodshed of battle, the family strife, the becoming, legitimate. But now I've got to watch my nephew shit himself to death. Spectacular.
Yeah, and possibly the nephew that he, Henry V was a great leader. Maybe Thomas Beaufort, in a way, hero worshipped him, and even though he was younger, looked up to him as his anointed king, this French slaying beast who's now shitting himself to death.
Oh gosh!
But Ben, in amongst all of the shit, Henry V has got one more job for Thomas Beaufort, and it's essentially to hang up his sword, and it's to become governor of the new king, Henry VI. Henry VI is only 9 months old when he inherits the crown from his dad, and it is to Thomas Beaufort, Henry V turns to charge him with the day-to-day upbringing of Henry VI. Thomas Beaufort now enters a new phase in his career as the guardian of his great nephew. Wow. And I think, what does that say about Thomas? I mean, when Henry V has looked around his entire nobility for somebody to take charge of the most precious youth in England, to raise him in a way that he probably viewed himself to be a father figure, who does he think has got the perfect qualities to do that? Conscientious, moral, devout, excellent soldier, clearly can do a bit of diplomacy, is learned, courageous. He gives the boy to Thomas Beaufort. Now, the great tragedy for England and for Henry VI would be Thomas Beaufort did not live long after this to raise this boy in how his father would perhaps have expected him to have been raised.
Makes you wonder if it would have been any different. I know Henry's personality is Henry's personality, and any sort of innate mental health difficulties may have, obviously existed, but it does make you wonder. It's nature, nurture, isn't it? There's always going to be a combination of the two. How different history may have been had that situation, had he lived even just another decade.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, Thomas Beaufort ends up living 4 more years, and he dies in 1426 in Greenwich, probably somewhere near where the O2 Arena now is. And it's quite interesting because, you know, like he's regarded by the chroniclers as a wise and well-learned counsellor to 3 Lancastrian kings, a man who's full of worthyhood. And he requests just a simple burial. He doesn't want anything for him, but he's given a state funeral. You know, he's given the whole shebang down at St. Paul's before he's buried next to his wife, who's already died in Bury St. Edmunds. And I think one of the sadness, I mean, it's not sadness, obviously, maybe he didn't want children, but Thomas Beaufort did not have any children. And I always wonder if he had had a brood of sons, what part would they have played in the Wars of the Roses? I mean, the Tudors would have been locked even further down the list. You know, a new Beaufort brood under Thomas Beaufort to keep on going. But yeah, you know, he's a great figure. I think the key thing for me, and I think this would bring my argument for Thomas Beaufort to be the greatest medieval figure people haven't heard of, is why do I find him interesting? Why is he my history hero? I've obviously already covered that he clearly was dependable, trustworthy, reliable. He accomplished clearly quite significant things as a scholar, as a statesman, and as a soldier. He was brave in war, clearly, telling the French, we do not surrender, and loyal to his core. He plays an integral role in the rise and the greatness of Henry V. But the key thing I like about Thomas Beaufort is there's evidence of him being quite a decent chap, quite a generous guy. The chronicler William Worcester writes after his death, and I'll have to quote you because I can't ever remember this because it's obviously written in that weird old English they write. William Worcester writes of Thomas Beaufort, every day he had 13 poor people, and each of them was always served with a first course and a second course of food with 2 loaves of bread. Each day he gave them 3 pence. He always paid the cook's fees, and he ordered 26 of gallons of pottage for the poor to eat. Sometimes 300, 200, or 100 of them each day he fed, and every day with wine. I mean, that's a decent friend, isn't it? On the eve of St. Mary, he always gave poor almswomen a set of bedclothes, mattresses, pairs of blankets. He always washed the feet of the poor on Maundy Thursday. He gave them money. Obviously, a lot of this is expected of noblemen during this day, but we don't get these recorded for many members of the 15th century. It's very specifically mentioned, all of these things that Thomas Beaufort does. The one thing he liked to do was if anyone had ever served in France with him, he would always provide them with food, fuel, and candles for the rest of their day. And most importantly, he did not abide swearers in his company. So we'd all be fucked. You know?
Oh no, they wouldn't like us at all.
No. But you know, the fact that this is mentioned, his generosity is mentioned specifically after his death, I think does say a lot about him. And I wonder, was he really trying with a simple funeral? You know, I'm sure he wasn't actually feeding 300 people a day. I mean, medieval chroniclers love to talk nonsense with numbers, but he clearly was doing good charity work during his day. Is he trying to pay back God for the horrors he saw at Rouen? You know, 5-6 months of people being starved to death in front of him. Was he trying to pay them back? I think the only final thing I have to say about Thomas Beaufort, unless you all have questions about him, is there is an interesting after story about him, which is probably quite apropos for Halloween. His grave was rediscovered in 1772 when a group of labourers were digging at Bury St. Edmunds, and they came across a coffin that was perfectly preserved, clearly of noble birth, where they would expect Thomas Beaufort to be buried. The remains, after being measured, 6 feet tall, etc., were eventually reburied where they remain today somewhere. But they took his hand. And for years, you could see this mummified hand in the Royal College of Surgeons until one day it just disappeared. So we don't know where his hand is.
Ew. Do we have anything in Thomas's own voice, like from when he was Chancellor or anything like that? Is there anything from him, or is it all just about him?
The one thing that I can remember, I mean, obviously, can you all watch and read my book, The House of Beaufort? I'm sure I've got loads of stuff that I've forgotten. But the one key thing I do remember is a very terse letter he wrote back to the King's Council, because you couldn't address the King directly, really pissed off that he was not getting any money or any supplies when he was captain of Harfleur. So when they first went off to France in 1415, those 6 months where they've asked him to do something, the King's asked him to do something, and he has no men, he has no supplies, he has no food, and he's proper pissed off. And I can't remember the exact quotes, but it's all written that very kind of like passive-aggressive medieval way that they used to do. And he kind of ends it with like, if you don't give me this money, then I'm going to give up the town. And they do give him money. They give him a couple of grand, which is decent, but he's still forced then to go on and launch this almost kamikaze mission to try and get some food, which nearly kills him. But apart from that, we are just getting to just before the period that we really started to get an abundance of letters, chronicles. We're still in the... It's why I do like the start of the 15th century. I mean, it's why I like the 15th century in full. But the start of it is... There's not too much to get overwhelmed by. It does make the discussions more interesting because there's such a dearth of material that we can actually start to maybe come up with more of our own interpretation. I mean, even by the time we get to Henry VIII, there's so much material being recorded. I don't know how 16th century historians are able to put their work together, let alone modern day historians. I mean, how the hell do you write a book about World War II, for example, or Brexit or anything? There's so much material. So I do like the 15th century for that. It does. I mean, everything I've said about Thomas Beaufort could ultimately be complete bullshit because we don't have that much sources. I've clearly built up a positive picture of the man. But no, the sadness is we don't have much to go on. We're really reading against the grain with Thomas Beaufort, where we're reading all about Henry VIII, Henry V, and we're then trying to go off and trying to glean bits and pieces from the sides, which again is what made that book really interesting to write. Because Wars of the Roses, full stop. You could write biographies about every one of those families, just from a different vantage point, and none of those vantage points are right or wrong. And that's the fascinating thing. I had a chat with Helen Castor about this, and I said it's really interesting for me because I wrote the Beaufort book and I had to write it from the vantage point of a family going into Wales during the Welsh uprising, and they were, in my book, the protagonists. I had to write everything from their point of view. In my latest book, I've now written the Welsh uprising from the vantage point of the Welsh. And it's really fascinating to have to discover all viewpoints, and you realise there aren't really goodies or baddies. There's people just acting with their own self-interest, and that's a lesson I think most of us can start to learn for today as well. I don't think there really are that much villains out there apart from Boris Johnson, and it's quite and it's just. And Helen said, the greatest medievalist. That is exactly the point. That is exactly how history learning is done. Being able to put yourself out of your own personal biases, etc., prejudices, and try to understand things from a different viewpoint. And maybe I should write a book with Richard III, and maybe I'll suddenly be... I mean, to be fair, I've studied so much Richard III. I'm probably way more Ricardian than most mainstream historians. I do see things from his viewpoint. A lot of it. I mean, I support kind of what he did in 1483, or what I believe he did, because it was the right thing to do. But a lot of people aren't making that effort to look at things from the other viewpoint. It's just histories of baddies and villains, and it's just nonsense.
Side taking is nonsense, especially in history. When we don't have any skin in the game, effectively. we can look at it objectively and people still find their tribe somehow and become tribal about it, and then miss so much nuance, interesting things by doing that.
Me and Matt Lewis had an interesting. We did the debate the other day at the History Festival with Nicola Tallis, and a question came up, and it was along the lines of how can we look at the same source and come up with a different interpretation? It's like, well, essentially that is history. I mean, there's a lot of baggage coming to the table. There's wider knowledge of what we know about the subject at hand. There's our own natural prejudices, our own biases. Every historian comes at something with a bit of themselves in it. The difficulty is trying not to let it get too extreme. But it is very simple to give a source. Like if you give a piece of paper with one sentence on it to somebody with no wider context whatsoever, the piece of paper is the fact, and that's it. I mean, this is critical thinking 101. I mean, this is obviously the problem of today. People read a tweet and they take the tweet at face value. Where is the wider critical thinking? Where is the wider experience that you've read around the subject to come up with a more nuanced viewpoint? And you might still disagree, but at least you've put some thought into it.
And isn't it interesting as well, because we've only got written sources, obviously, and even if you take out the fact that they're written for a purpose, we know the difference now between what the adoption of voice notes. I think it's not just easier because you haven't got to type, but your meaning comes across better in a voice note ever than it has in a text. And we know that now. So if you're looking at a document, you've got that as well to deal with.
Come on, we're all in relationships. How many times have we fallen out with our partners over a WhatsApp message? The tone's been taken without the intended tone. Yeah. It's like my mother. I'm always arguing with my mother, and when I ring her up, she's, "Hello, how are you?" I'm like, "Are we not having an argument?" "No, I'm okay."
Oh, you can't argue with your mom.
Yeah, well, of course I do. You must know I'm an argumentative person, but no,
No, you're soft as.
But yeah, you are right. I mean, obviously, and again, all of these sources themselves, there's no. One of the tiresome things I get with Printing the Tower Ricardian studies is a lot of this. They're Tudor propaganda. These sources are all have an agenda. They're written for this reason. There is no such thing as an unbiased source. It doesn't happen. Do you not think that the similar sources written during the Yorkist period of rule, during Richard's own period of rule, were written with their own agendas? Going back to some of the sources I've brought up today, one of the main ones is a chap called Thomas Walsingham. And he is one of the few sources we have for the life of John of Gaunt and Henry IV. And man, did he hate John of Gaunt. He despised him. I mean, Thomas Walsingham was a monk and a very, Orthodox Catholic. And John of Gaunt and the House of Lancaster, whilst being very devout Catholics, or, Orthodox for the day, they did have a bit of a flirtation with not having too much of a problem letting the Lollards or the followers of John Wycliffe preach some of their stuff. But that made people like John of Gaunt an enemy for Thomas Walsingham. So a lot of the sources we have for John of Gaunt are very negative because this one chronicle has a negative viewpoint of John of Gaunt. So you have to read around that. And you will drive yourself crazy tracing down a lot of these source biases. And yes, when you're writing narrative nonfiction, you can't always explain every source. Otherwise, you'll never get a book out for public consumption. But that's where you should be. As a writer, you need to be going down the academic route. You need to be following up all of your sources. You need to be following up your, don't just source that John of Gaunt said this because I read it in a book published 10 years ago. Well, where did that book get it from? And where did they get it from? And then go back and measure the source and then decide if you want to include it in your work or do you want to include it with a... But of course, you have to remember this Thomas Walsingham is...
a man of the church and didn't like the practices of John of Gaunt. Yeah. I mean, we could take something that we all agree on the facts and still interpret it differently today. you have an argument with someone and your mate goes, yeah, but are you sure they meant it that way? Because, you know, and
yeah. I think at some point you have to accept as well that, I mean, I think we're historians. You know, this is not an exact science. This is interpretation. This is understanding something and trying to put across an argument. And I think we also have to be careful of sometimes not being too cynical, because this is a debate I've had sometimes with people of a Ricardian bent, just because that's who I tend to discourse most with, in that, oh, we can't trust this, we can't trust that. And I sometimes throw up my hands and go, well, we can't trust anything. So what? Let's get rid of it all. I mean, a lot of the pro-Richard statements, Richard was brave in war, Richard was courageous, or anti-Henry VII, Henry was an avaricious, greedy monster. They all come from Polydore Virgil, for example. So if Polydore Virgil cannot be trusted on Richard III, but you do trust him on Henry VII, how does that work out? You're either a valid, credible source or you're not. Yeah, at some point you have to be like, look, this is what it is. If you want us to write history and produce history, this is what we have to go on. I can't go and find brand new, unbiased, objective sources. This is not science. This is not exact. Yeah. But there we go.
That's what makes it most interesting.
We need a time machine.
We're not going to use a time machine. Before this one starts kicking off, I have a what if question, I suppose. Do you think that if Thomas Beaufort had lived longer into the reign of Henry VI, perhaps even long enough to when some of the trouble started, I can't do the maths how old that would have made him, but might we be talking about him today as almost a William the Marshal figure?
Possibly. I mean, obviously, you know better than anyone, what ifs are difficult because you have to adjust for everything. And like Catherine suggested with Henry VI, we don't know, because he did have good mentors around him apart from Thomas Beaufort as well. Possibly. I mean, I think so. I mean, we obviously see the argument I've put forth, at least from my perspective, is that Thomas Beaufort really was a very accomplished, credible, respected figure. And I don't find it believable that suddenly he would lose all of those skills, unless, of course, illness, etc. hit. But all things being equal, he would have maintained that deep into the 1440s. Interestingly, his other brother, Henry Beaufort, the cardinal, the bishop, he lived until 1447, and he was the real big bankroller behind the Lancastrian dynasty. So as Thomas Beaufort was fighting and doing all of what I've mentioned tonight, it was Henry Beaufort all along funding the Lancastrian wars, funding the family. But then he fell out with his nephew Humphrey of Gloucester, and he started to have this really nasty feud in the 1440s, well, actually from the 1420s up to the 1440s, between Henry Beaufort and his nephew Humphrey of Gloucester, the brother of Henry V. And they birthed really two separate factions. Humphrey of Gloucester was very close to a certain Richard of York. And Richard of York followed the teachings of Humphrey of Gloucester. On the other side, we had Henry Beaufort, the cardinal, whose another nephew was Edmund Beaufort. And once those two men die, Gloucester and Henry Beaufort, the two young men go on to the next decade and go to war with each other. And it starts the Wars of the Roses. Now, I wonder if Thomas Beaufort had been around, if he could have been, whatever you want to call it, a stopped up in the middle of this brooding rivalry. Could he have been, look, you bunch of idiots, settle down, calm down, let's all defend the Lancastrian crown, continue to, because that's what happens. The old guard all die and they get removed. And particularly in 1447, when Gloucester and Henry Beaufort die within a couple of months of each other. I think it's actually a couple of days of each other. And then there's no one around. You just have a bunch of young men all fighting with each other over the next 30 years until a legend appears out of Wales with a dragon on his back to save the day and and take everybody's money so they can't do it all over again.
And it's the anniversary of his crowning today, is it not? His coronation.
It absolutely is a great day in English history.
We'll pretend we planned that. We planned to have you on that day. We knew this was happening, and that's why we asked you. That's what happened there.
Yeah. God, sorry. I mean, more importantly for me, today's actually the anniversary. 50 years since Muhammad Ali won the Rumble in the Jungle. That's more momentous for me than Henry Tudor.
Nice. Nice. This has been so interesting. It's not my period of history, but to have this kind of, I suppose, the dawn of the Beauforts and have this great understanding has been super useful. Thank you ever so much for taking the time to talk to us.
No problem. Thank you very much for listening.
The best bit of history, without doubt.
Where can people find you, Nathen? Where can people find you?
Right, you can find me all in the usual spots, but increasingly, please go to my Substack. Just type Substack Nathen Amin into Google and subscribe. Everybody else is charging you for it. I'm giving it away for free. Just come and join me there. I'm enjoying it. I'm doing book reviews. I'm doing posts. I'm starting to do audio content, and it's just fun. I'm just having fun. And hopefully one day soon I can get rid of all social media so you can just come and chat to me there.
The dream. Tell people about your books.
Yeah. Most recently I've published Son of Prophecy, The Rise of Henry Tudor, which, I mean, it does what it says on the tin. It's where the Tudors came from. But also go back and pick up The House of Beaufort. You know, it's my biggest selling book. It's by far my most successful book. It came out in 2018. No, it didn't. 2017. And it's so cheap these days. Just go buy a copy. Everyone buy a copy. It's a couple of quid. It deserves to have a resurgence. It's always sad. Yeah. The problem with writing these books is, you know, you have your little flurry for a couple of months and then it just disappears off into the ether, never to be seen or heard of again. So please go back, and I'm going to start pushing people's back catalogue. Yeah, that book's all right as well. Henry VII.
It's possible.
It's all right. But yeah, please go back and check out back catalogues of authors you like, because, you know, we put the work in. Buy the book.
Yeah, definitely. And this one's on Audible as well, isn't it? So if you're a bit stuck for reading time, you can.
Yeah, that was a tester for my publisher to see if Audible works. They seem to have done that book and then never done another one again for any of their books they've published over the last 20 years. So I don't know. Maybe it failed. Maybe they went, oh, to hell with this. But it is on Audible, so you can pick up that one.
That'll be my next one. And my credit comes in.
Although I did learn, so that book I kept all original spellings in. The Son of Prophecy book, I've modernized it because I want an audience to really read it, you know, quickly for good enjoyment's sake. The House of Beaufort's are more academic. I've written it more academically, more, you know, with original sources. But the audiobook is quite funny because he's struggling around pronouncing medieval English. Even the Woodvilles, I wrote like the Widevilles in the original contemporary spelling. So it is Elizabeth Wideville and the Widevilles, which is quite funny, I guess.
Well, it can't be as bad as the Hunting the Falcon. The lady's voice on Audible is lovely. Her voice is very nice, but every time she says Berlin, it sounds like Berlin. It's the whole way through.
Oh, right, yeah, okay.
It can't be that bad.
That's right. I mean, I'm Welsh. I butcher most pronunciations anyway. It's like, you know, I say, all South Welsh people say year, in that, you know, this is my year. The year is 2024, and I'm sitting year. They're all exactly the same. Although I have noticed when I'm doing history talks, I am going here. You know, if you look here, and I just, people laugh at me going, you're kind of creating this almost weird anglicization of certain phrases, and then when it gets to question time, we can barely understand you again.
It's amazing how many people go, Nathan's Welsh when you start speaking. You're like, yes, he mentions that quite a lot. Although I'm saying this now, we were been looking for some stuff in Edinburgh recently, and I said to Philippa, and I rang these people in Edinburgh, and they're all Scottish.
She was quite surprised.
Really quite genuinely surprised by this. I was like, I don't know what's wrong with me. I think I need to just get some sort of a grip. But I was really quite astounded by all these Scottish people in Edinburgh. I was like, confused me greatly. I think I just need to lie down for about a month. So, Nathan, thank you so much as always. And you're a very good influence on us, because look how well behaved we've been.
Yeah. I mean, we did talk about dying shitting yourself for a little bit. We did take a swift right turn in dysentery. So I'm gonna just go there. And if that is the sort of thing you like, maybe you'd like to reward us with some Winnebagos. You can do that by going to www.buymeacoffee.com/had podcast.
There it is at the bottom of the screen.
There you go. And it's also a place where you can join our close friends. Close friends on Instagram. That's a place where if you're joined, you're added to it. And then whatever depraved history memes Catherine finds on her travels, and she's a pervert, so she finds a lot. She will put those up on Close Friends and you can see them. So that's nice. We've got merch. You can check out Catherine's beaver. She's got a rough beaver. There it is. Check her out. We've got History After Dark merch. We've got No Feet Free on the Internet sliders. We've got Timmy is a Problem merch. Come along. It's a good time. There'll be more soon, because we're bound to say something else disgusting that we want to put on a t-shirt. So that's good.
That's got a list of things to add.
Yeah. We've got a list of vulgar stuff to put on
merch. Henry Fit, we've got Warboner merch.
There is
Warboner merch. That's another thing. Oh, he's going to kick off. Finish it up, ladies.
Yeah. What's happening next week?
I've no idea. What I do, I think I do.
Next week we have another guest.
Oh, it's confirmed. Okay, cool. So we have the wonderfully depraved Philip from Harvington Hall.
No, we don't.
Oh, I thought it was.
That's not what I've got.
Oh, I don't know then. See, I told you I didn't know.
I ain't got no unparalleled. No, that's
I know. I don't know.
I've got next week. I've got Gareth next week.
I don't even know what date it is.
Well, on my spreadsheet, ladies and gentlemen,
maybe I've set it up.
Gareth Russell. So it could be Gareth Russell. I'm 90% sure it's Gareth. But
it'll be happening.
Random surprises.
So that's it. No, because it's the week after I'm away. I was thinking I was away next week. I'm not. You're right. It's the week after I'm away.
Right. So next week we have the wonderful Gareth Russell. What's he talking about? The unknown warrior. Because originally, you see, this was the A to Z of history heroes, wasn't it? I like we've already covered all the possible combinations of letters that we could try and fob off as Thomas Beaufort, and I really just we can't make this work. So Thomas Beaufort. So we were going to cover the Tomb of the Unknown Warrior for you. Let's say that. So that's who Gareth's talking about anyway, the unknown warrior. And of course, we're around the time of Remembrance Sunday as well. So once again, more by luck than judgment, we've timed something quite well within this period of history. This period of history, do you know what? I'm like, whatever.
Like the video, share it with your friends.
It's not going well in my brain today.
Hit the bell icon, and that way YouTube allegedly will notify you when we are next here. All of those things. It does sometimes, not always. So always best to just check on our social medias, because we will be sharing it on the Instagram as well. A massive, massive thank you once again to the lovely Nathan. Please come back and we'll do some even more depraved stuff. You're always welcome. But for
you
now,
need to come when we play some sort of a game or something.
Oh yeah,
like the game.
Enjoy Halloween for all those who celebrate. I hope you'll be suitably spooky. I'm going to be a witch. This one's going to be Frankenstein's creation. My husband's going to be Dr. Frankenstein, and my other kid's going to be a skeleton because he wants to be a skeleton. So that's what's happening.
We're having a party. If anyone wants to come.
Well, everyone have a brilliant Halloween. shall I count us out?
That's out. Yeah, lovely. Bye, everybody.
Be good. If you can't be good, be careful. And if you can't be careful, don't get caught. We'll see you all next time. We're going to leave in 3, 2, 1. Bye.